This presentation looks at the issue of adaptation. At times when we are faced with challenges that come to us from outside our schools, we have to react quickly, and we might find that some of the things that we have to change, some of our new practices, are very worthwhile and beneficial to our organizations. So here are the questions I'd really like to address today from that perspective. How do crises force adaptations? How do we know if the resulting changes are something that are worth sustaining or not? And if they are worthwhile, how do we sustain them? So in order to think about our first question, we can think about changes in nature. Often we see an external force will come into our environment, our ecosystem, and it can cause a change reaction or a knock-on effect, which actually makes changes to different elements in our environment. Sometimes as a result of these changes, new things are introduced. Some things, old things, stick around. Sometimes they disappear, they're no longer useful or sustainable. Sometimes they adapt, and sometimes they just cease to work and no longer become useful to us. At other times we find old and new things can combine together to create something new that's really beneficial. And we call that process recombination. So when we think about schools, we can think about changes in our ecosystem as being changes in the social context, the economy, policy, public health. And there can be a knock-on effect in terms of changes that we have to make in schools, such as new pedagogy, changing our resource allocation, perhaps new relationships with students and families. And so we have to think about all of these things. How do we adapt? How do we take advantage of these new conditions and new practices to best support our students? And what's the job for our school leaders in guiding change, in assessing whether or not these changes are sustainable, and providing resources that are needed in a timely manner to make them happen? So one way we can do this is we can think about the concept of sustainability. And so sustainability we can think of as having three major attributes. One is resilience. So when things enter into our new organization, what happens to us? Do we maintain our agility? Do we realize that some things are harmful and should be removed? Do we try to conserve old existing good practices and keep them and enhance them for the benefit of our students? Is there a developmental aspect? In other words, does it enhance the capacity of our staff, of our leaders, of our students? Or is it really just not making any improvement or making lives better at all? There's also an ethical dimension. So does the new innovation or the new changes support diversity in our organization? So that could mean diversity of staff members and how they teach. It could mean diversity of students and their needs, their learning styles, and the diversity of our families. Do the changes actually lead to energy renewal, or are they just sapping our energies and we can never really seem to get ahead of it and make progress? So we can think of sustainability in terms of resistance, development, and ethics. So then, if we decide that we have some changes, some new practices that might be worth sustaining, how do we do that? Well, we can consider our infrastructure. So when we are challenged by new changes, we probably need to go first to infrastructure anyway, to think about how do we respond in the short term to make things work. So we can think about this in 4 different components: our roles, routines, tools, and practices. So roles, the people that we have, the jobs that we've defined for them, The routines could be normative practices that we use on an ongoing basis to support accomplishing a goal. The tools are the components, like assessment practices, like documents and templates that we use to make things happen. Professional practices could be things like coaching. So in our own organization at our university, probably just like you, we had to go very, very quickly from being a face-to-face university to moving to teaching online. So to do this, we had to evaluate these different aspects of infrastructure. So what you'll see in front of you is a table. The second column looks at our face-to-face infrastructure. We had to quickly in the short term make changes. So for example, our IT specialist had a role redefinition to becoming someone who actually serves more of a coach and a support to staff members in order to get things done. You'll see that we had to do other sorts of infrastructure in the short term. So then we have to assess if this seems to be working, if online seems to be supporting students. Is it resilient? Is it developmental? Is it ethical? Is it ethical when students are stuck at home in crowded conditions? So how do we then add, eliminate, recombine, adapt our infrastructure in order to make it meet those criteria of sustainability? Or should we? That, I think, is the leadership question. So for us, moving on, in this table you'll see in the second column are some of the infrastructure components we now have in place after having gone through our crisis. Now if we think these practices are or should be sustainable, we can start looking at some of the components in that column at the right. Are these things that we should be adding in order to address sustainability issues? So I think you and your own organization could go through a similar kind of audit of your infrastructure, both in terms of the short term, how do we respond to crises? How do we adjust our infrastructure? Then, is it sustainable? Is it resilient? Is it developmental? Is it ethical? Are further changes needed to make it sustainable over the long term? And if so, what are they? I think that's the question I want to leave you with. And that really goes to leadership, to determining how we can adjust our infrastructure to make all of this work.